Waitress helps 15 stranded billionaires in a snowstorm. Then 135 luxury cars pull up outside her house. Nobody in the town of Ashford could explain why 135 luxury cars were rolling slowly down Maple Street before sunrise. Not the mayor. Not the local sheriff. Not even the reporters who had begun arriving with cameras and questions. The only thing everyone knew was that the convoy had one destination. A small white house at the edge of town. The kind of house people drove past every day without noticing. The kind of house where the porch sagged slightly on one side and the mailbox had been repaired more times than anyone could count. And inside that house lived Emma Carter, a waitress. At exactly 6:12 a.m. The first black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of her driveway. Then came another, and another. Bentley, Maybach, Cadillac, Mercedes. The line stretched for nearly a mile. Neighbors stepped onto their porches wearing winter coats over their pajamas. Curtains moved. Phones appeared. Someone whispered that a foreign president must be visiting. Someone else guessed a movie star. Nobody guessed the truth. Because nobody would ever imagine that all of those powerful men had come for Emma. 24 hours earlier, nobody even knew her name outside the diner where she worked. Emma Carter was 28 years old, with honey blonde hair usually tied back beneath a simple black visor. She worked double shifts at Murphy's Diner, a small roadside restaurant sitting just off Interstate 87. Most days were predictable. Coffee refills, breakfast specials, friendly smiles, tips that never seemed quite large enough. Her life wasn't glamorous. The roof over her house leaked during heavy rain. Her mother's medical bills sat in a stack on the kitchen table. The furnace rattled every winter like it was arguing with itself. But Emma had a habit that people noticed. She never let anyone leave hungry if she could help it. Even when money was tight. Even when her own fridge looked nearly empty. Kindness came naturally to her the same way breathing did. On the afternoon before the convoy arrived, the sky had turned the color of steel. Thick clouds rolled across the mountains. Weather alerts flashed on every phone in town. Meteorologists called it the strongest snowstorm of the decade. Most businesses closed early. Roads emptied. People hurried home. Emma stayed. Murphy's Diner was still open. The old neon sign flickered against the growing darkness while wind pushed loose snow across the highway like white smoke. Around 7 p.m. Emma began stacking chairs and preparing to lock the doors. Outside, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. The storm howled across the empty parking lot. Then she saw headlights. At first there were only a few, then dozens. Long beams cutting through the snow. Vehicles crawling forward one at a time. Emma frowned and stepped closer to the window. Something unusual was happening. Very unusual. A line of luxury SUVs and executive sedans was slowly pulling into the diner parking lot. The first vehicle stopped. A tall man in an expensive overcoat stepped out into the storm. Behind him came 14 more. Men who looked like they belonged in Manhattan boardrooms. Not a small-town diner in the middle of a blizzard. Men accustomed to private jets and penthouses. Men who had probably never worried about finding shelter before. Emma watched the door swing open as cold air rushed inside. She had no idea that the next 12 hours would change her life forever. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Snow clung to expensive coats. Ice melted onto the diner floor. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows hard enough to make the old building tremble. Emma looked at the group and saw something unexpected. Not power, not wealth, not status. Just 15 tired men standing in the cold. The tall man who had entered first brushed snow from his shoulders and glanced around the diner. His sharp gray eyes took in every detail. The worn booths, the faded menu board, the ancient coffee machine humming behind the counter. This was clearly not a place he was used to visiting. "Are you still serving food?" he asked. His voice was calm but carried the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. Emma nodded. "The grill is still warm. That is good enough for me." Several of the men exchanged relieved looks. They quickly removed their gloves and gathered around the largest table in the restaurant. Emma handed out menus while Murphy emerged from the kitchen wiping his hands on a dish towel. The older man stopped when he saw the crowd. "Well," he said with a low whistle, "looks like the storm brought us company." One of the visitors checked his phone and frowned. No signal. Another tried. Same result. A third walked to the window and stared at the white wall of snow outside. "The highway is completely blocked." Emma poured fresh coffee into 16 mugs. The rich aroma spread through the room. One by one, the men wrapped their hands around the warm cups. Their shoulders relaxed. Their expressions softened. It was amazing how quickly people changed when they were no longer rushing somewhere. The man at the head of the table introduced himself as Alexander Hayes. The name meant little to Emma. She smiled politely and asked whether he wanted cream with his coffee. For the first time that evening, Alexander looked surprised. Most people reacted when they heard his name. She did not. She simply treated him like everyone else. The storm intensified as the night deepened. Snow piled against the windows. The parking lot disappeared beneath a blanket of white. Murphy turned on the television behind the counter. Every channel carried the same warning. Travel was impossible. Emergency crews advised everyone to stay indoors until morning. A nervous silence settled over the table. One man muttered about an important board meeting. Another worried about a canceled flight. A third complained about losing an entire day of business. Emma listened quietly while carrying plates of hot soup from the kitchen. Finally, she set down the last bowl and offered a small smile. "You cannot control the weather," she said gently. "But you can have dinner." A few men laughed. The tension eased. Even Alexander smiled. It was brief, almost invisible, but it was there. Hours passed. Coffee became pie. Pie became conversation. Outside, the storm continued its relentless march across the mountains. Inside Murphy's diner, the warmth grew stronger. Yet none of them knew the real problem was only beginning. At 10:30 that night, the town's last motel posted a notice online. Fully booked. Every room gone. Every bed taken. And suddenly 15 billionaires realized they had nowhere to go. The news landed like a weight across the room. 15 men who controlled companies, investments, and fortunes worth billions suddenly found themselves facing a problem money could not immediately solve. One by one, phones came out again. Calls were attempted. Assistants were texted. Drivers were contacted. Nothing worked. The storm had swallowed every plan they had. Murphy folded his arms behind the counter. "The church shelter filled up hours ago," he said. "The motel only has 20 rooms in the first place. Folks started booking them this morning." A man near the end of the table sighed heavily. "There has to be another hotel within 50 miles. Murphy shook his head. "Not one you are reaching tonight." Silence followed. Outside, snow pressed against the glass. The wind whistled through tiny gaps around the old front door. Emma watched the group quietly. She noticed something interesting. Earlier they had looked powerful. Now they looked worried. Human. The difference was smaller than most people realized. Alexander leaned back in his chair and stared at the weather report on the television. Red warnings covered the entire region. "How bad is it?" he asked. Murphy glanced outside. "I would not drive 10 feet in that tonight." One of the billionaires laughed nervously. "Well, this is a first." Another nodded. "I closed a $4 billion merger last month. Tonight I cannot even find a bed." A few men chuckled. The humor helped, but only a little. Emma carried fresh coffee to the table and began refilling cups. When she reached Alexander, he looked up. "You seem surprisingly calm." She shrugged. "Storms do not care who we are." Something about the answer made him pause. His eyes followed her as she moved away. A few minutes later, Murphy disappeared into the back room. Emma continued cleaning tables. She was stacking menus when the old diner owner returned carrying a ring of keys. His expression was thoughtful. "There might be one option," he said. 15 heads turned immediately. Murphy pointed toward the rear hallway. "Storage room has 6 cots. The office has a couch. There are blankets in the supply closet." Several men looked uncertain. One raised an eyebrow. Another glanced toward his expensive suit. Emma could almost hear their thoughts. They were imagining spending the night in a diner. Alexander surprised everyone by standing first. At this point, a blanket sounds like a luxury. The others laughed. Real laughter this time. The tension cracked. Murphy smiled. That is the spirit. Emma disappeared into the hallway and began gathering supplies. Extra pillows, spare blankets, an old space heater. She worked quietly while the men rearranged tables and chairs to create sleeping areas. Nobody asked her to help. She simply did. Half an hour later, Alexander walked toward the counter and found her carrying an armful of folded quilts. "How many people live in this town?" he asked. "About 3,000. And you are willing to give up all these supplies for strangers?" Emma set the blankets down gently. "Nobody should spend a winter night cold if I can help it." Alexander looked at her for a long moment. Not because the answer was dramatic, because it was sincere. In his world, generosity usually came with contracts, negotiations, or expectations. Emma's kindness seemed to arrive without any of them. And for the first time that night, the billionaire began wondering who this waitress really was. The diner slowly settled into an unusual kind of quiet. Not the quiet of an empty room, but the quiet of people surrendering to circumstances they could not control. The television volume had been lowered. Coffee cups sat half-finished on tables. Snow continued sliding against the windows in soft waves. Emma moved through the room checking blankets and adjusting the small space heaters Murphy had managed to find. She never announced what she was doing. She simply noticed what people needed and handled it before they had to ask. One businessman shivered while trying to sleep in a booth. Minutes later, an extra quilt appeared across his shoulders. Another could not find a phone charger. Emma located one in a drawer behind the counter. A third mentioned missing dinner because of delayed travel. She quietly brought him a fresh sandwich from the kitchen. The acts were small, almost invisible, yet Alexander noticed every one of them. He sat alone near the front window, watching snow swirl beneath the parking lot lights. In the reflection of the glass, he could see Emma wiping down counters even though the diner had technically closed hours ago. Most people would have gone home if given the chance. Emma kept working. Eventually she walked toward the coffee machine and began preparing another pot. Alexander glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight. "You are still awake?" he asked. Emma smiled faintly. "Someone has to keep the coffee coming. You could have left us here and gone home." She shrugged. "My house is only a few blocks away. You are the one stranded." Alexander studied her expression. There was no resentment, no complaint, no attempt to impress anyone. Just simple honesty. "You know who we are now?" he asked. A few of the names sounded familiar. "And that changes nothing?" Emma poured coffee into a mug and handed it to him. "Should it?" Alexander looked down at the cup. In boardrooms, people changed their behavior the moment they learned his net worth. Their voices changed. Their smiles changed. Their expectations changed. Emma treated him exactly the same as she had 6 hours earlier. Outside, a powerful gust shook the building. Several men stirred in their sleep. Murphy had already gone to rest in his office. The diner belonged to the storm and the strangers trapped inside it. Around 1 in the morning, Emma finally sat down for the first time all evening. She pulled a worn envelope from her apron pocket and began looking through a stack of papers. Alexander noticed her shoulders tense slightly. Curious, he glanced over. Medical statements, payment notices, hospital bills. Emma quickly returned them to the envelope when she realized someone had seen them. "I am sorry," Alexander said. "I was not trying to pry." She offered a small smile. "It is all right." "Family?" Emma nodded. "My mother." The answer was brief, but the emotion behind it lingered. Alexander looked away, giving her privacy. Yet something stayed with him. The woman who had spent hours helping complete strangers was carrying burdens of her own. Heavy ones. Still, she had never mentioned them. Never asked for sympathy. Never asked for help. As the storm continued across the sleeping town, Alexander Hayes found himself thinking less about missed meetings and canceled flights and more about a waitress in a small diner who seemed richer in character than many people he had known his entire life. At 2 o'clock in the morning, most of the diner was asleep. The storm had not weakened. Snow covered the parked vehicles so completely that only their shapes remained visible beneath the white drifts. The world beyond the windows seemed to have disappeared. Emma quietly moved through the room collecting empty mugs and folding spare blankets. The lights above the counter cast a warm golden glow across the diner. Everything felt still. Then she noticed a figure standing near the entrance. It was Alexander. He had not gone to sleep. He was staring out at the storm with his hands in the pockets of his overcoat. "You should get some rest," Emma said softly. Alexander smiled faintly. "That is usually advice I give other people." Emma carried a stack of dishes toward the kitchen. "Then maybe tonight you should listen to it." The comment earned a quiet laugh. For a moment they stood in comfortable silence. Then Alexander reached into his wallet and placed a thick stack of bills on the counter. For the food, the blankets, the inconvenience, and everything else. Emma looked down. It was more money than many people in town earned in a month. She pushed it back toward him without hesitation. Alexander blinked. "You did not even count it." "I do not need to. You should take it." Emma shook her head. "You were stranded. I helped. You provided shelter for 15 strangers. That is what decent people do." Alexander studied her face carefully. There was no performance in her voice. No false humility. No attempt to negotiate for more. She genuinely meant every word. Most people would accept it. Emma folded a dish towel and placed it beside the coffee machine. "Most people have their reasons. I have mine." The billionaire looked down at the money still resting on the counter. Throughout his career he had solved problems with resources, contracts, investments, and numbers. Yet this waitress kept presenting him with something unfamiliar. Principles. He slowly returned the money to his wallet. Across the room, one of the sleeping businessmen shifted beneath a blanket. Emma immediately walked over and adjusted the quilt to keep the cold away from his shoulders. The gesture was automatic. She probably did not even realize she had done it. Alexander noticed. He noticed everything now. A little later, Emma disappeared into the kitchen. When she returned, she carried only a glass of water and a plain piece of toast. Alexander frowned. "That is your dinner?" Emma looked surprised by the question. "Breakfast, technically. You fed 15 guests and that is what you are eating?" She smiled. "I am not very hungry." But Alexander remembered the stack of medical bills. He remembered the aging furnace she had mentioned earlier. And suddenly he suspected the truth. Emma was making sure everyone else had enough before thinking about herself. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Outside, the storm continued its endless song. Inside Murphy's diner, a quiet lesson was unfolding. Wealth could purchase comfort, could purchase influence, could purchase nearly anything. But character was different. Character revealed itself in the small moments, in the choices nobody expected, in the things a person did when nobody was keeping score. And without realizing it, Emma Carter had just given 15 billionaires something far more valuable than shelter. Sometime after 3 in the morning, the diner became completely silent. The storm still roared outside, but inside, exhaustion had finally won. The businessmen slept beneath borrowed blankets. The coffee machines rested. Even the old refrigerator seemed quieter than usual. Emma stood alone near the back hallway folding towels that did not really need folding. It was simply something to do while her mind wandered. On the counter beside her sat the envelope of medical bills. She looked at it for a moment before sliding it into a drawer. Then she switched off half the lights to save electricity. It was a habit she had developed years ago. Every dollar mattered. Every small expense counted. As she walked through the diner one final time, she paused beside an old photograph hanging near the register. A younger Murphy stood smiling beside a man in a white medical coat. Emma's father. The picture had faded around the edges. She gently straightened the frame before moving on. Unknown to her, Alexander was awake again. From his seat near the window, he watched quietly. He had spent years studying people, negotiating with them, evaluating them, predicting them. Yet Emma remained difficult to understand. Most people talked about their sacrifices. She hid hers. Most people advertised their generosity. She treated it as normal. Most people asked what the world owed them. Emma seemed more interested in what she could give. He watched her carry an old quilt toward one of the sleeping guests. The blanket was worn. The edges had been repaired several times. She carefully draped it across the man's shoulders before turning away. A few minutes later, she entered the small storage room in the back. The door remained slightly open. Alexander could see part of the room from where he sat. There was a folding chair, a portable heater, a shelf filled with supplies. Emma lowered herself into the chair and finally allowed her shoulders to relax. For the first time all night, she looked tired. Not ordinary tired. The kind of tired that came from carrying responsibilities for a very long time. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she pulled out a notebook. Under the dim light, she began writing numbers. Medical expenses, utility payments, mortgage amounts, prescription costs. Alexander could not read the details, but he could recognize concern when he saw it. Emma stared at the page for several seconds before drawing a careful line beneath the total. Then she smiled. Not because the number was good, because worrying would not change it. She closed the notebook and stood up again. Back to work. Back to helping others. Back to being the person everyone depended on. Something shifted inside Alexander Hayes at that moment. It was not pity. Emma would hate that. It was respect. Deep respect. Because while many people spoke about strength, she lived it quietly every day. No audience. No recognition. No reward. Just dignity. And standing alone in the darkness of Murphy's diner, Alexander made a decision. If the storm ended tomorrow, he would leave like everyone else. But he would not forget Emma Carter. Not after what he had witnessed that night. Not after seeing the kind of character that money could never buy. Morning arrived quietly. The storm had finally exhausted itself sometime before dawn. Sunlight spilled across the snow-covered landscape, turning every rooftop and pine tree into a field of silver. Murphy's diner felt different in the morning light. Smaller somehow. More ordinary. As if the strange night had never happened at all. One by one, the businessmen woke up. Phones began buzzing again as cell service slowly returned. Messages flooded inboxes. Assistants checked in. Drivers reported road conditions. The familiar rhythm of their powerful lives came rushing back. Yet something had changed. The conversations were quieter. The complaints were gone. Several men stood near the windows, simply watching the sunlight reflect off the snow. Emma was already working. She had been awake for nearly an hour. Fresh coffee filled the air. Bacon sizzled on the grill. The breakfast special was written neatly on the menu board. To her, it was just another morning. Alexander sat at the counter nursing a cup of black coffee. He watched her greet each guest with the same warm smile she had shown the night before. No special treatment. No expectations. No mention of what she had done for them. It was as if she had already moved on. Around 8 o'clock, the first snowplows cleared the highway entrance. News spread quickly through the diner. The roads would reopen within the hour. Several of the businessmen immediately began gathering their belongings. Luggage was retrieved. Calls were made. Schedules were rebuilt. The interruption was ending. Murphy handed out breakfast plates while joking that his diner had accidentally become the most exclusive hotel in New York State. Laughter filled the room. Even Alexander smiled. Yet beneath the humor lingered a feeling he could not quite explain. Felt wrong to simply leave. Around 9 o'clock, the group began preparing to depart. One after another, the men approached Emma to thank her. Some shook her hand. Others offered kind words. A few attempted to leave generous tips. Emma accepted the gratitude but politely refused every oversized payment. The reaction surprised them each time. Finally, only Alexander remained. The others had already stepped outside to inspect the cleared vehicles. For a moment, the diner was quiet again. Just the two of them. Alexander stood from his stool and looked around the room. The worn booths, the old photographs, the faded walls. Then he looked back at Emma. "Can I ask you something?" Emma nodded. "Why did you help us?" She seemed genuinely confused by the question. "You needed help." "That is not what I mean." Alexander paused. "You did not know who we were." Emma glanced through the window toward the parking lot. "No. And if you had known?" A small smile appeared on her face. "Then I would have known 15 people needed help instead of 15 strangers." The answer settled between them. Simple, honest, unshakable. Alexander lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time in years, he found himself speechless. Outside, engines began starting. The convoy was preparing to leave. But as Alexander walked toward the door, he carried something far more important than luggage or business plans. He carried a promise that Emma Carter knew nothing about. The next day felt completely ordinary. That was what made it so surprising. Emma worked her morning shift at Murphy's Diner. She refilled coffee cups. She greeted regular customers by name. She listened to Murphy complain about the snow piled outside the back door. The 15 stranded travelers had become little more than a strange story people shared over breakfast. By noon, life had returned to normal, or so she thought. Late that afternoon, Emma finished her shift and walked home through streets still lined with snowbanks. The air was crisp and clear. Sunlight reflected from every rooftop. Children played near the town square. Nothing seemed unusual. When she reached Maple Street, however, she noticed something strange. Cars. Lots of them. At first she assumed there had been an accident farther ahead. Then she turned the corner and stopped walking. Her entire street was filled with luxury vehicles. Black sedans. Silver sport utility vehicles. Chauffeur-driven town cars. The line stretched so far she could not see where it ended. Neighbors stood outside staring in disbelief. Some were taking photographs. Others simply watched with open mouths. Emma looked around, certain there had been some mistake. Then she noticed where every vehicle was parked. In front of her house. Her small white house with the repaired mailbox and the aging porch. A television news van sat across the street. Reporters spoke quietly into cameras. More vehicles continued arriving every few minutes. The entire neighborhood had become frozen in confusion. Emma heard someone call her name. She turned. Murphy was standing beside his pickup truck. "Emma," he said slowly, "do you happen to know why half of Manhattan appears to be visiting you?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, because she honestly had no answer. At that exact moment, the first limousine door opened. A chauffeur stepped aside. Alexander Hayes emerged. He wore the same calm expression she remembered from the diner, but now he was joined by familiar faces. One by one, the other 14 businessmen stepped from their vehicles. They crossed the snow-covered street together. Conversations stopped. The entire neighborhood watched. Emma stood perfectly still. Alexander approached until only a few feet separated them. Then he smiled. "Good afternoon, Emma. What is all this?" she asked quietly. Alexander glanced around the street. "A thank you." Emma stared at him. "This is not a thank you. This looks like a parade." A few of the businessmen laughed. Alexander nodded. "Perhaps it does." He turned slightly toward the gathered crowd, toward the reporters, toward the neighbors who had spent years passing Emma's house without a second glance. Then he looked back at her. "You gave 15 strangers shelter when nobody else could. We felt people should know the kind of person who lives here." For a moment, Emma did not know what to say. She looked at the line of vehicles, at the faces surrounding her, at the men whose lives she had briefly touched during one winter storm. And somehow she sensed that this extraordinary day was only beginning. The crowd continued growing as more people gathered along Maple Street. Reporters adjusted cameras. Children stood on snowbanks trying to get a better view. Neighbors who had lived beside Emma for years suddenly looked at her as though they were seeing her for the first time. Alexander waited until the street became quiet. Then he nodded toward one of the vehicles. A woman stepped forward carrying a small wooden case. She handed it to him and quietly returned to the group. Alexander approached Emma and placed the case in her hands. "What is this?" she asked. "Please open it." Slowly, Emma lifted the lid. Inside rested a brass key mounted on a polished wooden plaque. Beneath it was an engraved message. Her eyes moved across the words. For several seconds she did not speak. Murphy stepped closer and read over her shoulder. His eyes widened immediately. The key belonged to a newly renovated restaurant building on Main Street. A building that had sat empty for years. Emma looked up in disbelief. Alexander smiled. 15 owners. 15 votes. Unanimous decision. She stared at him. "You bought a restaurant?" "No," Alexander said gently. "We bought your future." The crowd fell silent again. Another member of the group stepped forward carrying a second envelope. Emma opened it carefully. Inside was documentation establishing a medical care fund for her mother. The expenses that had filled her notebook for years. The worries she carried every night. The numbers she had faced alone. Gone. Her hands trembled slightly. Not from shock. From relief. The kind of relief that arrives after carrying a burden for so long that you forget what life feels like without it. Tears filled Murphy's eyes. Several neighbors quietly wiped their own. Yet Alexander was not finished. He pointed across the street. 2 workers carefully uncovered a bronze plaque mounted on a stone pedestal. The polished metal reflected the winter sunlight. Emma stepped closer and read the inscription. This place remained open on the coldest night of the year because one woman refused to let strangers suffer. Emma Carter reminded us that character matters more than status, kindness matters more than wealth, and dignity requires no audience. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Even the reporters lowered their microphones. Some moments are too sincere to interrupt. Emma looked at the plaque, then at the people standing around her, then at the 15 men who had arrived as strangers and returned as friends. "You did not have to do all this," she said softly. Alexander nodded. "You are right." He glanced toward the crowd. "We did it because people spend too much time celebrating success and not enough time celebrating character." The winter sun began sinking lower behind the trees. Golden light stretched across the snow-covered street. Emma stood quietly holding the brass key. The crowd slowly applauded. Not loudly, not dramatically, just sincerely. And as the sound echoed through the neighborhood, something remarkable happened. For the first time, Emma understood that the greatest gift she had received was not the building, the fund, or the recognition. It was proof that kindness is never wasted. Sometimes it disappears into the world unnoticed. Sometimes it returns when you least expect it. And sometimes, on a quiet street after a snowstorm, it comes back with 135 luxury cars, simply to remind everyone that the richest people are not always the ones with the most money. They are the ones who never stop caring when nobody is watching.